welcome. Good evening to everyone from India, and good morning to Professor Graham Harman. My name is Sukhendu Das. I'm speaking on behalf of Center for Research in Posthumanities Bankura University. This is the opening lecture of In Memoriam lecture series, and Professor Graham Harman is our first speaker. It's a pleasure and an honor to introduce our esteemed guest today, Professor Graham Harman. Professor Harman is a philosopher and distinguished professor of philosophy at Southern California Institute of Architecture, Los Angeles. He is one of the highly influential philosophers and most original thinkers of our time. And I have data to claim this. In 2015, he was ranked by Art Review as the 75 most powerful influence in the international art world. And in 2016, he was named by the best schools to their alphabetical list of the 50 most influential living philosophers. He has so far written 22 monographs, many edited volumes and articles. Some of them are Prince of Networks, Bruno, Latour, and Metaphysics, Bruno Latour, Assembling the Political, Immaterialism, Objects and Social Theory, Object-Oriented Ontology, and his latest book, Architecture and Objects. I must acknowledge my debt to him. Actually, these two books, one is Bruno, this book, Bruno Latour, Reassembling the Political, and also his another book, first book on Bruno Latour, Prince of Network. These books introduced me to the rich legacy of Latour's thought. In fact, he is one of very few early scholars and philosophers who took painstaking effort to make Latour's ideas accessible to the English-speaking world. We have with us our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Debnan Bandyopadhyay. Now I would request Professor Bandyopadhyay to inaugurate this event with his brief remark on this event. Professor Bandyopadhyay.
Thank you very much, Sukhendu, for inviting me to inaugurate this event. I'm really grateful to Professor Graham Harman. I was just trying to look at the huge philosophical dissemination in his work. Particularly, I was struck by his book, Networks, which is available because it's open access now, so I could get hold of the book. In fact, I find that he belongs to the Department of Philosophy at Southern California Institute of Architecture in Los Angeles. And the huge nature of, and the complex nature of his work really struck me very much. And it reminded me of the famous or infamous Bonaventura Hotel in Los Angeles. It's very postmodern kind of architecture which baffles you, intrigues you, and makes it so very complex. And I was really very struck by the work of Graham Harman. And I believe that we all will be benefited by listening to his wonderful so I'll not take much time. Rather, we would like to listen to Professor Harman. Thank you very much for being here.
Now, I would request our registrar, Dr. Saurabh Datta, to briefly share his thoughts on this event. Dr. Datta, are you here?
Yeah, thank you,
Yes.
Mr. Shindu.
Welcome, sir.
It's an honor for Bankura University. I, on behalf of Bankura University, wholeheartedly welcome Professor Graham Harman and a philosopher, a distinguished professor of philosophy, Southern California Institute of Architecture, Los Angeles. I hope it would be a huge learning experience for all the listeners, for the entire audience. Not only that, this is the beginning of this journey, as Mr. Sukhendu very rightly pointed out, that this is first lecture of international level, and I came to know that this is on somebody, a great French philosopher, anthropologist and sociologist, Bruno Latour, who passed away only a couple of months ago, 9th October, and he was especially known for his work in the field of science and technology studies. I was going through some of his work for last couple of days, and I came to know that I'm delighted to say that having a lecture from someone like Graham Harman on Bruno Latour is going to be a fantastic experience for the entire Bankura University community. Again, I put wholehearted gratitude to Professor Graham Harman, and I wish this event a great success. Thank you very much.
Professor Jayanta Kumar Saha, our dean, is not available with us. He is busy somewhere else. Okay, now I would request Professor Harman to deliver his talk, and we all are eagerly waiting for his insightful talk, Latour and the way forward. Professor Harman, the stage is all yours now.
Thank you, and I want to say it's an honor for me to speak in India. It's maybe my first lecture in India, even if it's remotely, but I've visited India 4 times and just finished teaching Indian philosophy this semester. So it's a country that I have a lot of interest in. As for Bruno Latour, as you all know, he passed away a couple of months ago. It was my privilege to get to know Latour's work over the course of several decades, and also to know the man himself for the last 23 years of his life, and was able to see his system of philosophy develop in its latter stages. And I will never grow tired of speaking about Bruno Latour. In fact, it was mentioned that I've written 2 books about him. I actually have a 3rd one that I've just not quite been able to finish, but it should be done before too long. Bruno Latour, of course, is one of the established stars in the social sciences of recent decades: anthropology, sociology, STS, meaning science, technology, and society. Everyone in those fields knows who Latour is, and his ideas have been much debated in those circles. He has had a much less happy fate in philosophy. Even though his background was philosophy, he wanted to be known primarily as a philosopher. In fact, as you may know, in the French academic system, there's a so-called agrégation exam, which gives you the right to teach philosophy in either first a high school and then a university. And Latour actually finished in 1st place in France on that exam, even though he wasn't coming from one of the elite Parisian universities, which usually produce the winners of those exams. Latour was coming from Dijon in his home province of Burgundy. But his interest quickly turned towards the anthropology of sciences, which is a term that no longer surprises us, but it was a big surprise when he first began studying in this way, because, of course, it was believed at the time, in the modern period, that science is simply a direct access to the truth, whereas anthropology is something you do to study people who somehow aren't quite up to the task of Western scientific rationality. And so you're studying the religions or the customs of a tribe as though it were something inferior to the Western rational scientific position, whereas Latour's innovation was to study scientists as if they were a tribe with their own strange rituals and their own customs. And of course, this did not endear Latour to scientists, many of whom like to see themselves as something different in kind from all other countries, as if modern Western science were somehow a privileged access to reality in a way that past cultures were not. So that's the way you can frame Latour's career, as a philosopher whose work was done primarily in the anthropology of the sciences. There's a story he tells, some of you may know, from his book, Science in Action, that I find a fascinating story. This has to do with the time that Latour was doing his national service in West Africa in place of military service. You know, in many Western European countries, you can do your national service in a non-military way. And Latour's method of national service was to do an anthropology of some people in Western Africa. It was either Senegal or the Ivory Coast. I think it was Senegal. My memories this morning. And a party was hosted for them by their chief informant, a man named Anselme. It was Latour and another French anthropologist. It was a farewell party for them. There was a feast on the beach where this man lived. And at the party, they were given the warning, just don't go swimming because there are dangerous currents here. The currents can suck you out. Well, the other Frenchman had a few too many drinks and decided to go out swimming anyway. And sure enough, he was carried out by the currents right away. Anselme, the host of the party, jumped into the water to go out to save the Frenchman. And the current soon washed the Frenchman back in. But the African host of the party, unfortunately, was drowned. The man who had hosted the party died at the party. And his body washed ashore. And the African hosts all assembled at one end of the beach, having a very angry discussion about what had happened. And Bruno Latour was holding his infant daughter and was standing next to his wife, quite afraid that these African people were going to be very angry at him and the Frenchman who had gone swimming, since they had caused the death of this kind African man who had hosted them. And finally, after a while, the angry conversation ended. And the Africans returned to speak to the two French anthropologists. And Latour was very worried, and they said, we know whose fault it was. And Latour is worried they're going to blame the other Frenchman and then blame him by extension. And they said, no, it's Anselme's aunt, because she owed him money and she hadn't paid him back the money. And so this was a message from the gods somehow. She wasn't even at the party. And yet they had determined that she was at fault, and she was the one who was going to be blamed for the drowning, rather than the Frenchman, who we would blame, naturally, because he is the one who broke the rules and went swimming. And that led Latour to reflect on whether or not his sense was fair, that this was absurd to blame the aunt who was not even at the party. And Latour started realizing that every culture has its own way of assigning blame, and it's not necessarily any more rational than what happened in the case of that party in Senegal. And the example he used was drunk driving deaths. Who do we blame for drunk driving deaths in Western countries? We have decided to blame the drunk drivers. And to be sure, drunk drivers deserve the blame. They deserve some blame, at least. Drunk drivers are drinking a lot of alcohol, going out and driving, exposing everyone to danger. And so if there's a drunk driving accident, we blame them, we punish them. They may go to prison. They may be sued by the surviving family members. However, we might also consider that absurd if we look at the fact that we might also blame the alcohol companies for advertising too much. We might blame car companies for not putting safety features in the cars that would prevent drunk drivers from starting the ignition. You know, there are certain cars where you have to blow into the breathalyzer and prove that you're not intoxicated before you can drive, and so on. And so Latour there was simply trying to put our civilization back on the same level as the Senegalese civilization, which seems so foreign to us in the way they assign blame, but that our ways of assigning blame might also be considered anthropologically. So that's just an opening antidote to talk about the way that Bruno Latour would think about situations, and part of the reason why he was so often viewed negatively by the modern scientific community with disputes. And yet he also saw himself as a lover of science. He would not have called himself a social constructionist, someone who reduces science to the social arrangements that make science possible. If Latour was a social constructionist, it was only in the sense that he has a much broader concept of society. Society doesn't just mean human society for Latour. Society also includes the characters belonging to so-called natures, such as the sun, such as electrons, such as viruses. All of these things are part of society too. And so Latour's philosophy was really about breaking down the modern distinction between nature and culture. And so if you haven't read any Latour yet, and you're wondering what to start with, the best book to start with is probably We Have Never Been Modern. Very short book from Harvard University Press, English translation from 1993. It was published in French 2 years earlier than that. And to my mind, this is the most important philosophical book after World War II. And I'm one of the few philosophers who thinks that. So I have to justify that. I was still in Egypt. I was in Egypt from 2000 to 2016, so quite a while. Early in my stay there, in 2003, we invited Bruno Latour to be a guest lecturer. He would have been 56 years old at the time, a little bit older than I am now. And he said that was only the second time he had ever been invited to a philosophy department. Amazingly, the first was the University of California at San Diego, which is known for its hardcore neurophilosophers, Patricia and Paul Churchland. So it's interesting that they would have been the first and we were the second. And it's possible that a few more philosophy departments invited Latour between 2003 and his unfortunate death this October. But I don't think it was many more. He is still, for some reason, resisted by philosophers as counting as a philosopher. He is still mostly known to social scientists. So I want to talk a bit today about why that is and maybe how that could be fixed. But just to finish up what I was saying about his book, We Have Never Been Modern, modern thought tends to work by holding that there are two separate and purified domains. There is nature, which is mechanical, has no freedom, it works with clockwork necessity, and nature works the way it works, whether you like it or not. And it's our job simply to know that nature. That's what science does. Then, on the other hand, supposedly there is this domain of culture, which is simply arbitrary, and each culture projects its own values arbitrarily onto a cold and gray universe of matter. Latour's contribution was to forcefully question this division by flattening it all out onto a single level. Everything, both nature and culture, counts as what Latour calls an actor. The word actor is somewhat like the word object, except obviously the word action is included in actor. So for Latour, anything is real as long as it does something to other things. So physical matter is real because it collides into things and damages it or interacts with it in some way. Humans are real because we interact with the world. Animals are real because they interact with the world. Things like numbers don't just have an ideal existence because numbers affect other things. Cartoon characters, unicorns, fictions, all of these domains are just as real as the domain of physics because all of them are equally actors. Anything that has an effect on anything else can be considered a real actor. And the influence here, you can see, has a lot to do with American pragmatism. Latour would often call himself the only French pragmatist. Latour saw himself as a pragmatist in the sense that Charles Sanders Peirce and William James thought that the ultimate cash value of any idea was what difference it makes to us. They didn't want to have any intellectual disputes about things that make no difference to the world or to us. And Latour saw himself this way too. Any concept or any entity that does not make a difference cannot be really considered real. And yet cartoon characters and fictional characters and impossible things like square circles have an effect on our minds when we think about them, or have an effect on something else, and therefore they have to be considered actors. So actor network theory is the name for the theory that Latour and two colleagues, Michel Calon and John Law, came up with to discuss the way that all entities in the universe are in some way on the same level. They're in some way on the same footing. In the first place, we can't say that the objects discussed by science are any more real than the objects discussed by literature, because they are all actors. We also cannot say, the way that modern philosophy in the West says since Descartes, that the mind is somehow more real than physical things. Latour does not accept the idea that we somehow have closer access to the human mind than we do to anything else, the way René Descartes believed. Latour thinks that everything in the world that does something is equally an actor. Some of them are stronger than others. The sun is a much stronger actor than a fictional character like Mickey Mouse. The sun affects many more things than Mickey Mouse does. Mickey Mouse only affects human beings and only a small subset of human beings, mostly children, who care about Mickey Mouse and watch his cartoons. But Mickey Mouse is still an actor just as much as the sun, even though the sun has a huge gravitational force on everything in the solar system. So that's probably the first thing for which he is known. We call this a flat ontology, the idea that everything is equally real, even if everything is not equally strong. And so Latour's theory has a lot to do with trying to figure out where actors get their strength from. What makes an actor stronger than other actors? And his answer to this is usually an actor becomes stronger when it has more allies. The more alliances an actor can make, the stronger it is, because more alliances become dependent on it. So an example would be if you follow the course of a scientific theory, when it's first an idea in someone's mind, and then is something being tested by a laboratory, and finally is an accepted textbook fact, what happens is an idea begins in a scientist's mind. For example, in the case of Louis Pasteur, a science about whom Latour wrote an entire book. The usual interpretation of Pasteur is that he's simply a brilliant scientific genius who brought light to darkness. Pasteur discovered the truth that germs are causing disease. And then he simply met with resistance, and Pasteur had to fight all this resistance. And then finally, after 20 or 30 years, people realized that Pasteur was right, and medicine advanced. Latour tells the story in a more interesting way. He wants to ask himself, how did Pasteur manage to convince people? Who were the people he convinced first? Who were the people he didn't convince as easily? And the story turns out to be as follows. Back in the mid-1800s, there was a interest group of people called hygienists, people concerned with hygiene. And this had a lot to do with the growth of capitalism. The growth of industrial capitalism in France, as throughout Europe, workers were becoming sick a lot, right? The workers were not good enough to work consistently every day because they would have diseases, they would die young. And the hygienists put themselves to studying, why aren't our workers healthier? Because it's a major economic problem. And so they started coming up with a list of rules that they couldn't really explain. But the list of rules was things like, it seems like people who haven't had enough sleep are not working very well. It seems like people who don't wash their hands before eating get sick a lot. It seems like people who live next to a garbage dump become sick a lot, and so on and so on. So they had a list of these hundreds of rules of things that seemed to make people more healthy or less healthy, but they had no way to explain this. Here is where Pasteur's theory enters, because Louis Pasteur, with his germ theory of disease, gave all these hygienists a reason, a unified reason for why people were becoming sick. Factory workers are becoming sick because they are becoming exposed to germs. Pasteur must be right. We need to find ways to stop the spread of germs so that our factory workers can be healthier and more productive. So he convinced the hygienists first. Ironically, the group that opposed Pasteur at first, you'll never believe this, was medical doctors. And there are two reasons for that. The first reason is that, according to Pasteur, health becomes a public matter rather than a private one. If diseases are caused by germs and germs spread, this means that there needs to be a new field of public health, where we ask people what germs they've had, what diseases they've had, and then we trace the spread from one person to the next. Now, this broke one of the pillars of the medical profession, which was confidentiality or secrecy, which is that if a person told a doctor that they were sick, the doctor is not allowed to tell anybody. And we still have medical secrecy and privacy, with the exception of public health. Right? If somebody has COVID or somebody has strongly drug-resistant tuberculosis, that cannot remain a secret. This person has to be quarantined. The public needs to know. And maybe we don't need to know the name of the person. Maybe we don't need to put their name on television. We can give them privacy in that way, but we need people's diseases to be reported to the public authorities so that we can stop the spread of it. And so you can see why the doctors were opposed to this at first. The other thing, and this is hard to believe, is that when Pasteur first became famous, it looked as if vaccinations might end all diseases. All human diseases might be cured simply by giving vaccines to everybody for everything. Today, of course, we know that's no longer true. Those were later discoveries, however, because now we know that not all diseases are caused by bacteria. Many, of course, are caused by viruses, and some are caused by parasites. And vaccines don't normally work. Vaccines work against some viruses, but not as easily as against bacteria. And so Latour essentially tells the story of how, rather than just being a a candid truth teller, Pasteur was somebody who had to assemble allies on his side in order for his theory to become true. He needed to find the first ally, which was the hygienists. At first, the doctors resisted him. How did he finally get the doctors on his side? It turns out it was through a political deal. The deal was, if doctors would go along with Pasteur, doctors would attain a medical monopoly. Charlatans would be banned from practicing medicine. Faith healers and bone breakers and people who sell snake oil, magical potions that supposedly cure you. Those people would be banned by the government, and doctors with proper technical training would be the only ones allowed to give medical treatment to the public. And because of that, the doctors eventually came aboard with Pasteur's revolution. And that is the world we know today, the world where nobody wants to drink unpasteurized milk in most cases because it's too dangerous, where we keep food in refrigerators, where we cover food because we don't want it contaminated with germs. We live now in a post-Pasteurian world instead of a pre-Pasteurian world. But it's not just because Pasteur came along and told the truth against ignorant people. It's because Pasteur knew how to assemble allies. Now, this is why some scientists call Latour a social constructionist who thinks power is the only truth. But you have to remember that Pasteur's allies are not just human. Non-human things must also be enlisted as his allies. So Pasteur gains germs as allies as well, because the germs give certain results in experiments. And so in that case, the germs work on Pasteur's side in this controversy, just as the dog with rabies did. And the boy who was bitten by the dog with rabies, who was successfully cured by the injections that Pasteur gave him. So you always have to remember that Latour is not reducing science or truth to society. He's simply increasing his concept of what society means. Society means every actor that exists. And that includes the sun and germs and dogs just as much as it includes human society. So maybe that gives a good first stab at the theoretical framework in which Latour is working. Côte d'Ivoire, thank you, Ottavio. Yes, it was Côte d'Ivoire where this incident happened, not Senegal. Okay, now I want to talk about several other aspects of Latour's philosophy. But first, I want to talk about a couple of problems with the flat ontology I've just been discussing. As a reminder, flat ontology means that all entities are treated equally as actors. For everything in the world, you have to ask, what does it do? Not what it is, but what does it do? So if you ask about Mickey Mouse, you have to ask, what effects does Mickey Mouse have on children and on others who watch the cartoons? And when you're talking about a mathematical concept, you also have to ask, what does it do to the minds of mathematicians? What does it do to other mathematical concepts? And so on. Okay. Well, one of the upsides of this is that it allows Latour to look more concretely at certain situations. So Latour never talks about things like society or science or capitalism, because for him, these are just giant abstractions. You have to look at what each of these terms means locally. So one book about capitalism that Latour admired was Fernand Braudel's 3-volume History of Capitalism. And if you've ever looked at that book, you'll see that unlike Marx's theory of capitalism, Braudel doesn't look at capitalism as a giant abstraction. He tries to look at how it evolved from local markets to regional markets to international markets. And so he focuses more on monopoly capitalism. And so he tries to draw a distinction between small businesses and international monopoly capitalism. Whereas in Marx, you'd see more of a continuity between those. Even in someone like Zizek, you see more of a continuity between those. So that, Latour obviously also science. He's able to talk about science in a very concrete way. Instead of just talking about science as a set of true results, he has a method that allows him to go back and look at how a scientific truth was discovered. What were the processes by which one theory defeated an older theory? Sometimes these scientific battles are much closer than we think they are and could have gone one direction rather than another. Another controversial idea of his, that sometimes it's not entirely clear which scientific theory is true, and sometimes an older scientific theory is resurrected and comes back from the dead, so to speak, after we think the other one has been proven. And so science is always in motion in that sense. Okay, another thing that actor network theory allows Latour to do is to focus on what he calls science in the making or science in action instead of ready-made science or finished science. In other words, that you're looking at the whole chain of events by which a scientific truth was established. And here is an area where I'm not sure he's always right, because I think Latour has the intuition that a scientific theory, like if you say E equals mc squared in Einstein's most famous equation, is just an abbreviation or a shorthand for a whole series of actions that Einstein performed to come up with that theory. And so you can't just say E equals mc squared. You have to go back and read Einstein's diaries and read the whole thought process by which he came to that. And that's why many scientists think Latour is really just doing sociology of science or biography of science rather than science itself. Because for scientists, the scientific result has a privileged status compared to the biographical or historical arrangements that one had to pass through to reach the scientific fact. E equals mc squared for most scientists can exist in a vacuum. You don't have to know the whole history of how it was discovered. You might be interested in reading that, but that's history of science. You don't have to know that to do the science. Whereas for Latour, you always have to know that the full meaning of E equals mc squared has to be the whole history of how it was discovered. Now, I'm not sure that this is true. This is one point where I disagree with Latour. And my disagreements came into focus in Bruno Latour and Albina Yaneva's article on architecture, which is very interesting. What they're saying in that article is that architecture is not about a finished product, not about a finished building. Architecture is about a whole series of actions that has to be done by the architectural studio, by the construction companies, by the governmental authorities who approve the building, and that every building is a story that's still being written because a building can still have future uses and so on and so forth. Now, I think this is a very interesting article for the anthropology of architecture, or studying how architects do their jobs. But ultimately, when you build something like a piece of architecture, you are trying to create an independent product that is independent of you. Anytime you make something, you bake a cake. Well, there's a whole process you go through to bake a cake, but what you're trying to produce is a cake that can be eaten by anyone, even those who do not know the process by which you baked the cake. And another way to phrase this is that Latour maybe doesn't count for emergence well enough, right? If you have hydrogen and oxygen together, we get what's called emergence, where you get water, which has properties that neither hydrogen nor oxygen have in isolation. So, for example, both hydrogen and oxygen are fuel for fire. Water puts out fire. But put hydrogen and oxygen together, you're not getting a fuel for fire, you're getting something that puts out fire. And so the water has an emergent property that you don't find in either hydrogen or oxygen alone. And there's not a very strong sense of emergence in Latour's philosophy. There's just the sense that you can, he calls this a black box, right? That a completed building, like the Empire State Building in New York, is a black box. And you can always open it and ask yourself the history of the things inside this black box. In fact, there's a really good book out there called Empire, State, and Building. It's about the Empire State Building, clever title, Empire, State, and Building, which is where this writer went back and traced where all of the supplies for the Empire State Building came from in terms of global capitalism, which parts came from Brazil, which parts came from Egypt, what's the history of the land on which the Empire State Building is built. You know, during the American Revolution, it was a farm. And he goes through and tells this fascinating story about where the land for the Empire State Building came from and where all the pieces of the building came from. And it's very enlightening and very interesting to read that. And yet you don't need to know that stuff in order to go into the building and use it, right? The building is a finished product in a certain sense. It allows people to forget the history, use the building without knowing the history. You don't have to know the technology behind your computer or your iPhone in order to use it. If you did, that would be very complex for society. We would need to be filled with a society of technicians, which we don't need, and we need people to focus on other things. Cars are another such example. Most people driving cars have no idea how a car works, except for the basics. So here's one point where I would differ from Latour. I don't think you need to know the whole history, the whole backstory of an object, because the object is, in a certain sense, cut off from its own history. An object doesn't need all of its parts, right? You can, some of the windows on the Empire State Building could break and you simply put new windows on. It makes no difference that they're not the original windows because the form of the building is the same. Okay, more centrally though, I mentioned that for Latour, anything is real if it acts on something else, if it has an effect on something else. This means that Latour is what we call a relational ontologist. He doesn't think anything exists in itself. A thing only is the effect that it has on other things. And this, again, the strong influence of American pragmatism here, but also the strong influence of Alfred North Whitehead, the great English philosopher who peaked in the 1920s, author of Process and Reality. And earlier, I spoke about how Latour is not really appreciated by philosophy departments yet. Well, it could be a very long time for Latour because it's already been 100 years for Whitehead. Whitehead is still not widely appreciated by philosophers. And that is true of both the analytic and continental traditions, the two opposed traditions of recent philosophy. You don't find a lot of Whitehead in either of those traditions. You might find some Deleuzians reading Whitehead. You do, actually. And in analytic philosophy, you find people who respect Whitehead's mathematical work with Bertrand Russell. But most of these people would consider Whitehead kind of a crazy speculative philosopher. In fact, there's a big purple book from Cambridge University Press called The Cambridge History of Modern Metaphysics. And why am I blanking on the guy's name? British philosopher who wrote this history of modern metaphysics from Descartes forward. And the remarkable thing is that that book, which is a kind of definitive history of modern metaphysics, does not have a chapter on Whitehead. It does have a chapter on Deleuze. It does have a chapter on Bergson and Collingwood and a lot of analytic philosophers. Nothing on Whitehead, who may be one of the greatest metaphysicians in human history. Well, I think it's because Whitehead flouts the Kantian model of doing philosophy, which Whitehead and Latour both oppose. The idea that thought is one thing and the world is another. And so the first problem for philosophy is to rigorously figure out how thought relates to that world. This is something that isn't really a big problem for Latour and Whitehead, because for Latour and Whitehead, the relation between thought and world is just a special case of the relation between any two objects. So that the relation between my mind and reality is no more special or important for Whitehead and Latour than the relation between the Paris metro and the train tracks that the train is running on, or the relation between the sun and a comet that's orbiting every 200 years. All relations are on equal footing for Latour and Whitehead, and I agree with that part of their philosophy. Object-oriented ontology, which I practice, agrees with them on that. Where I would disagree is that Whitehead and Latour think of entities, of actors, of objects, as consisting only in their relations to other things. And this is a problem that goes all the way back to Aristotle. In Aristotle's metaphysics, he criticizes the Megarians in ancient Greece, who were his contemporaries, for saying much the same thing. The Megarians were saying no one is a house builder unless they are building a house right now at this very minute. If you're a master house builder who's asleep, then you're not really a house builder because you're not doing it. And Aristotle responded that this is somehow absurd, because if they are right, then a master house builder who is asleep is no better than me, someone who is awake, who has no idea how to build a house. Aristotle said any philosophy must account for the fact that master house builders are not always building, or that doctors are not always practicing medicine. So this is what led Aristotle to introduce his concept of potentiality, that there can be real things that are not currently expressed. Well, there's not really any potentiality in Latour. A thing only is what it does right now. In the case of Whitehead, it's a little more complicated, because he would say there is potentiality, but I would argue it's not a strong enough sense. But this isn't a lecture about Whitehead, so I'll leave that for another time. The point just being that for Latour, nothing exists outside of relations to other things. It's impossible. Nothing is real. The fewer relations a thing has, the fewer relations an actor has, the weaker it is. And if it has no relations at all, then it doesn't really exist. You have to be affecting something else in order to have more strength. And I would point one problem with this, which is that it seems to follow from Latour's theory that the more alliances and associations a thing has, the more powerful it is. Whereas we know that sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes a thing becomes stronger by stripping down its excess associations. For example, consider the case of a business. It's often known in the business world that it's a good idea for a corporation to sell off some of its businesses and focus on its core business, right? So if Disney or Apple starts owning too many companies, they may decide that it's distracting their main efforts. And Apple may say, really, we just want to be a computer and a telephone company. So let's start selling off these other companies to focus on our core business. Strictly speaking, in Latour's theory, that would make Apple or Disney weaker, because they are shedding off some of their alliances. Whereas we know sometimes in reality, you want to get rid of weak alliances and focus on your strongest alliances. However, in sociology, there's also a phenomenon called the strength of weak ties. This is from an article written by Mark Granovetter, who is still alive, professor at the University of California. I recommend this article strongly. It's called The Strength of Weak Ties. You can find it on Google. His idea there is that a lot of our biggest lucky breaks in life come from fringe acquaintances and people we don't know that much. That close friends and family provide emotional support and loyalty, but it's very unlikely that you'll get a lucky career break from a family because you and your family are already sharing all the information and all the opportunities you have. You're more likely to get lucky from a link that's weak, from somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who recommends something to you through 3 or 4 steps. This is the idea behind LinkedIn, I think, on the internet, that by mapping all of the links you have directly and indirectly with other people, your career will somehow be strengthened by finding all these indirect connections you have. Anyway, I just mentioned that in passing. Now, there's a difference between Whitehead and Latour, even though they are both relational ontologists. And that is that even though Latour tries to break down the divide between humans and non-humans, there always ends up being humans somewhere in the picture for Latour. You would call Latour a philosopher of science, but you would never call Latour a philosopher of nature. Why not? Well, because Latour doesn't really talk about nature itself apart from humans. Latour wants to talk about how humans find out about nature. His actor network theory is used to discuss how scientific facts are established for humans. Latour gives no theory of independent nature, whereas Whitehead does. Whitehead you could very much call a philosopher of nature. Whitehead's also a philosopher of humans, but he does have a philosophy of what nature is like. And the detailed findings of science play a key role in Whitehead's philosophy in a way that isn't quite true for Latour's philosophy. Why is that? It's because Latour, even though he tries to put nature and culture on the same footing, in the end, he doesn't quite do that, because Latour ends up identifying nature with things in themselves, and he ends up identifying culture with things for us. And since he believes everything is a relation, he believes we somehow have to be involved in those relations. We can't say anything about the sun without knowing how humans made those discoveries about the sun. So to tell a story about the sun means to tell a story about human astronomers as well. This is probably the main difference between Latour and Whitehead, is that humans are always involved in the picture somewhere. But Whitehead and Latour share a problem, I think, ontologies. I mentioned the example of Aristotle, that you need to account for potentiality somehow in a strong way, that a thing might have a reality that isn't expressed right now, that currently isn't expressed. You may be very, very good at a certain profession or field that simply doesn't exist right now. That is, to tell an old joke from my family, that's a true joke. My younger brother, when he was 19 years old, was not doing very well in university. He wasn't studying very hard. His grades were bad. My parents were a little annoyed with this, right? Because they were paying for his studies. And so they asked him why he wasn't studying harder. And my brother's somewhat comical example was, I'm a genius in a field that doesn't exist yet. And of course, we all laughed at that. That was a great excuse for not studying much. But it turned out that he was. That happened in 1991, that story. And then in 1994, the World Wide Web was introduced. And my brother, I don't know if he's a genius at the World Wide Web, but he's made a good career out of it. He ran Barack Obama's iPhone campaign. He's had some great successes as an internet person. And so in a way, he was right. He was struggling in school because he wasn't interested in his major. If he had known about the World Wide Web 3 years earlier, he would have already been succeeding at that, but it didn't exist until 3 years later. Or think about what would Michael Jordan have become in the Middle Ages when there was no basketball. He couldn't have been the greatest basketball player of all time. It did not exist. And so you can see that for each of us, there are certain circumstances in which we would flourish, but we never find those circumstances. And so you can't say that we are only our current set of actions and associations, right? We are also a number of potentials that are currently unexpressed. And this is my objection to the idea that everything is relational. Okay, I need to move on a little faster through the other steps. I think I've got only about 20 minutes left. Is that right?
Yes, Professor, you can take much time. There is no time.
Yeah.
We've got time, Professor. Yeah, you can. We have got time. Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
I was going to talk about three more aspects of Latour's philosophy. The next aspect is his philosophy of modes, as in his important late work, Inquiry into the Modes of Existence. Very long and systematic philosophical book published in, I think, 2012 in French, 2013 in English. And what Latour tries to do in this book is work against his earlier philosophy. He tries to work against actor network theory. Because as he says in this book, after a while, actor network theory can sound kind of repetitive, right? That everything in reality is made of groups of heterogeneous actors linked together in a network. Latour says that about everything. He says that about Pasteur. He says that about the discovery of DNA. He says that about anything he studies. There turn out to be all these heterogeneous associations of humans and non-humans that link their forces together to create some result. And Latour says, okay, that's true, and he's proud of that discovery, but maybe it becomes a little repetitive and boring. And his way of improving, in his opinion, improving his previous philosophy, actor network theory, is to add the modes of existence. And I've got a message here from Ottavio. Let me get to that a little later, Ottavio, about the mode of reproduction. If you look at Latour's book, Inquiry into Mode of Existence, he gives 15 modes of existence, grouped into 5 triads. That's somewhat misleading. I happened to see the original version of this book, which he presented at a conference in France in 2007 at Cerisy-la-Salle. And there were about, 50 or 60 of us there, maybe 100. And we got to read the draft. And I think the way it was arranged then was more true to the spirit of the project. What Latour had then were 14 modes. And you have 2 modes that govern all the rest. Those modes are, first of all, network, which means everything arranges into a network. And the other one was what he calls preposition, which means every network is inside of a particular mode and doesn't cross modes. And perhaps the easiest way to explain modes is this. Modes are different spaces or different frequencies within the world where things can exist, but they're not necessarily commensurable. So perhaps the easiest example is that Latour names politics, religion, and law as 3 separate modes of existence. What he wants to do there is he wants to end the scientific monopoly on what truth is during modern period. In the modern period, we consider science to have the last word on truth in pretty much everything. We might realize there are some gray human areas where science can't tell us what to do, like science can't solve ethical problems for us, or science maybe can't quite judge poetry for us yet. So people will admit that there are some fuzzy gray areas that need to think with the heart rather than with the mind or something like that. But for the most part, science is considered in the modern period to be the gold standard of truth. Now, Latour points out that that cannot be the case. There are already some other modes of truth where we do not allow science to have the last word. And the one that everyone would agree on, surely, is the law. Okay, why is the law somehow excluding science? Because obviously you can bring scientific experts into a trial. They often do. DNA experts or other forensic experts, experts on bullets, on gunpowder, all kinds of scientists come into a modern trial. However, the legal authority always trumps the scientific authority. For example, let's say that one of the sides in a court case brings in scientific evidence, but it's after the deadline for evidence. It doesn't matter how true the scientific evidence is. The judge will exclude it because it missed the deadline. Or let's say the prosecutor has some very good scientific evidence, at least in the US legal system. The prosecution has very good scientific evidence, but they never give it to the defense to look at before the trial. Under the US legal system, at least they have to. They're required to give all their evidence to the defense so the defense can look at it and try to come up with counter evidence against the prosecution's evidence. If the prosecution forgets to do that or deliberately doesn't do it, the judge will throw it out. So no matter how true a scientific finding about a criminal case can be, it can always be excluded for legal reasons. Also, a fact in law, a fact can be established as fact simply if the other side does not dispute it. So you don't have to prove a fact in law to establish it as a fact. You just have to say it, and then if the other side doesn't challenge it, the judge will assume that it's true. So that's a different rule. That rule doesn't apply in science, right? If you say something in science and no one challenges it, that just might mean that they don't have a reason to challenge you yet. They haven't done the experiment themselves yet. And so it's not really a truth in science if you've just said it and not proven it. Whereas in the law, it is if the other side does not challenge it. So Latour pointed out that the fact that we all agree that law is something a little different from science already allows us to get our foot in the door on non-scientific concepts of truth. The second example being politics. Latour always had a lot to say about politics and why politics cannot be made a science. Partly that's because political agreements are always contingent. Different groups have to agree on it, or at least enough groups that it's the majority or 2/3 or whatever governmental system you're in requires. Politics is not something that can be calculated scientifically. Politics is something that has to do with a compromise among different interest groups. And political coalitions can always be opened up. They can always collapse. They're always contingent. They are always temporary. Also, we never exactly know what the truth is in politics. All we know in politics is that there's a consensus about something. And it's a consensus that gives the government legitimacy. So, for example, in most modern democracies, there is a consensus that the majority should rule. That the majority, in most cases, should be the one that decides rather than a minority. Now, there are exceptions to that, of course, right? The majority doesn't vote on everything in democracies. In the legal system, it's judges. It's not the majority that decides. In the United States, we have a Senate as one of our two houses of legislature, and the Senate is not based on majority. It's based on 2 senators per state, which is kind of undemocratic because some states have very few people. Some states like California, where I am, have many people. But that was there as a compromise. That was a compromise between the large states and the small states when the Constitution was written. So anyway, politics involves various stakeholders for Latour, and it cannot be an area where we decide scientifically. We're never going to come up with political truths in the same way that we come up with truths about chemistry or physics. There's no way to do it. Also, in politics, you might be having to compromise with people you think are evil or very bad, which is not true in science. Right? In science, if you think someone is wrong, you will fight them all the way to the end. Whereas in politics, that might not be the best decision. Right? You might have a rebel country, for example, and you try to destroy them. You fight a 30-year guerrilla war against this rebel group. And then in the end, you decide, let's make peace with these people. Even though they've done lots of violence, let's just make an agreement and stop the killing. So you can think about, say, the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland involving the British with the IRA, that a decision was made just to, let's end this fight. Instead of trying to track down this group and destroy them and catch everybody who ever did anything, let's just put this to an end for political reasons. Or the United States involvement in Afghanistan. When the United States pulled out of Afghanistan a year and a half ago, it's not because the United States likes or trusts the Taliban. It's simply because the war was becoming too expensive and long for the United States public to want to continue it. So that's, again, a political decision. It's not because anybody in the United States likes the Taliban any more than they did. It's just a political compromise, maybe good, maybe bad. Now that brings us to the last and most controversial one, which is religion. Latour, of course, being a rarity among French philosophers these days and being a practicing Catholic and a very serious one. And so Latour sees religion as having its own mode of truth as well. It's a truth that can only speak to the faithful. It's not the kind of truth where you can go up to a materialist, reductionist, scientific-minded person and prove to them that Christianity is true. But if you believe in the truth of Jesus as the Son of God, certain facts become open to you, Latour held. Now, here's the odd thing about Latour's religious views. Latour also has a social conception of religion. Latour tends not to believe that God is an objective thing that exists outside our minds in outer space or something. Latour has the tendency to think of religion as existing only in the rituals that constitute religion. And so you could raise the question as to whether Latour is really religious at all, or whether he is really just aesthetically attracted to the rituals of the Catholic Church, whether he likes going to confession and going to mass and things of that sort. On the other hand, when you talk to him, you got the sense of a very sincere religious conviction. He took his religious life very seriously. And yet, on a theoretical level, there's not really any room for him to think of God as something that really exists outside of our minds in the scientific sense. He's interested in what religion does, the effects it has on people, how it makes them act. So, interestingly, that makes him pretty close to the theory of religion of his rival, Émile Durkheim, the French sociologist, who saw religion as a way of building up social bonds. And Latour disagrees with Durkheim on pretty much everything pertaining to society and sociology. And yet, Latour, the theist, and Durkheim, not really the theist, have similar views about religion in the end. So that's of interest. Okay, that's one set of three modes. That set of three modes has to do with different conditions of truth: the political conditions of truth, the legal ones, and the religious ones. We'll get to the scientific ones in a minute, but I first wanted to talk about the three modes into which Latour decomposes economics. Latour thinks there's really no such thing as economics. It's one of his great enemies, because economics tries to calculate everything with one number. It's a very modern enterprise. Whereas Latour thinks economics is actually a hybrid composed of three different modes, which he calls organization, attachment, and morality. Organization, of course, has to do with how institutions are put together. Attachment has to do with our passions, because when you buy something, you're not just transferring money from yourself to a store and taking a good. You are expressing interest in what your passions are. You are making a statement about the things that you're enthusiastic about, what your hobbies are, the things that you need to survive. And economics covers up all of that. Economics reduces everything to a number and loses the human attachment to goods that we have. And that would be Latour's argument against the Marxist critique of commodity fetishism and the Marxist critique of consumer society, is that Latour has a certain soft spot for consumer society, right? Consumer society provides things that we actually love and that we want and need. And that economics, whether it's Marxist or liberal economics, tends to lose the fact that these goods are objects of supreme interest for us. And then the final one is morality. That even the most cutthroat economic system makes some room for morality. I mean, there may be a few people in any society who don't. There may be people who simply calculate and don't mind selling others as slaves or don't mind doing evil things in order to get money. But for most people, there's a limit to things they would do for money. And so in that sense, economics occurs within a certain moral framework. Most of us would probably stop buying certain products if we learned bad things about where the products were coming from. Like, I already feel bad enough about having an iPhone from reading about the bad conditions of factory workers in China who are making them. If I were to learn that iPhones were actually made by slaves, I'd probably not buy one again, because I don't want to subsidize slavery. Now, you might say maybe I am subsidizing a form of slavery by buying the iPhones from people who are not making much money and are working in horrible conditions in China. But I think most of us feel at least some sense of ethical obligation to not buy things that exploit people too much. And there's always a debate about how far we go with that. Or maybe there's a certain country you feel like boycotting at a certain time because you don't like what the country is doing. So some people are boycotting Russia right now because of the Ukraine war. A lot of people boycott Israel over Palestinian issues and so forth. So morality is also part of economics, but economics hides morality, attachment, and organization. Okay, Ottavio has mentioned in the window the mode of reproduction. That belongs to another group of three modes that don't really belong with the others, because Latour claims that all of his modes of existence are historically determined and that they only apply to Western civilization. In fact, Latour invites other civilizations to come up with their own list of modes that apply in those civilizations. I don't know that anyone has done this. Maybe someone has tried this from some other civilization, but I don't know of it. And the problem is Latour in his book doesn't give any examples of the historical emergence of a mode. For example, Latour never tries to tell us when did law emerge as a separate mode from politics. Presumably this didn't happen in the Stone Age, right? Presumably this happened, or maybe in the late Stone Age. Somebody decided that law should be independent from politics, or maybe it was in Rome, or who knows. Latour never gives us a history of that. Latour also never gives us any example of how another culture's modes might differ from ours. But he also has a few modes that he thinks are universal. And one of them is REP, R-E-P, which stands for reproduction. And this is not a historical mode. This is a simple metaphysical claim on Latour's part. The mode of reproduction for Latour means nothing exists for more than an instant. Everything has to be reproduced again and again and again every instant. You have to maintain everything in existence. There is no inertia. A thing would disappear if nobody or nothing is maintaining it constantly. Now, this is an anti-Bergsonian metaphysics that Latour has. For Bergson and for his followers like Deleuze, becoming is primary, flux is primary. There are no individual instants of time. Time is a flow that naturally moves forward. Things naturally endure even though they change over time. There is not a series of instants where things disappear and are being recreated. Latour's theory comes from what we call the occasionalist tradition, which began in medieval Islamic philosophy for theological reasons. The Orthodox Muslim view, and the Orthodox view for all Jews and Christians, and many other religious people as well, is that God is the only creator. The universe was created by God. Nobody else created it. There's only one God. Okay, that's basic monotheism. A certain group of Islamic thinkers known as the Ash'arites from southern Iraq, from Basra, had a more rigorous interpretation of that idea. They said that God is not just the only creator. God is also the only causal agent at all. Only God can cause anything to happen. And so when fire burns cotton, it's actually God burning cotton. It looks like the fire and the cotton are touching, but actually it's God who's making the cotton burn. Fire cannot do it. That would be blasphemous because only God can do anything. Causal relations between things in the world are illusions. It just looks like two things are touching. If two cars crash together and smash, the cars aren't actually touching. God is actually making the cars smash at that moment when they seem to touch. Nothing's actually touching anything else. You might remember this from Leibniz's philosophy. Monads have no windows. Because this idea came into European philosophy starting in the 1600s, right after Descartes, where it's known as occasionalism, where God is the only bridge between any two things that exist. That's the tradition that Latour comes from, and that's the tradition that Alfred North Whitehead comes from. The idea that causal relations are a problem. How do you make two things linked together to have an effect on each other? Well, Latour and Whitehead have different solutions for that. Whitehead also thinks it's God. Whitehead thinks any two objects, he calls them actual entities, can only relate to each other through gods. All of what he calls the eternal objects are in God, which are all the qualities. And so if you look at my shirt and you see brown, actually my shirt is all the colors of the rainbow. When God looks at my shirt, God sees all the colors of the rainbow. You only see brown because you are passing through God and prehending my shirt, is Whitehead's term. You're relating to my shirt through the color brown. And so you're only seeing it as brown. So God is still the center for Whitehead. Latour, interestingly, even though he may have been more religious than Whitehead personally, Latour never likes using God as a solution to problems in his philosophy. He somehow feels that's an illegitimate maneuver. And so Latour says there's always a local mediator. There's always a local bridge between any two objects. And the example he gives in Pandora's Hope is the example of the French atomic bomb project, which didn't last very long. But the French did begin some early research into atomic bombs right before they were invaded and knocked out of the war. And Latour asked the interesting question, why should politics and neutrons have any relation? Neutrons were not even discovered until James Chadwick in 1932 in England. Nobody would have thought that there was any political meaning to neutrons. They were just these very tiny subatomic particles with no electric charge. How can neutrons be political? Well, they became political because they are so important for creating nuclear fission, for creating the atomic bomb and nuclear power as well. And the first person to see this in France was Frédéric Joliot-Curie, who was married to one of the daughters of Pierre and Marie Curie. And so it was Joliot who linked politics and neutrons for France. That's Latour's answer. And he says any link between any two things always has a third term mediating them. The problem is that Latour never explains how Joliot touches politics or how Joliot touches neutrons. So there would be an infinite regress. You'd have to find, if you say Joliot linked politics with neutrons, what links Joliot with neutrons? Maybe a microscope. What links Joliot with a microscope? His eyeball. What links Joliot with his eyeball? His nervous system. What links Giulio with his nervous system, his brain? What links Giulio with his brain? It could be an infinite regress. And I don't think Latour ever manages to solve that problem. I try to solve that problem in Prince of Networks, my first book on Latour, by saying that there are actually two kinds of objects, real and sensual, and those can touch. But that's a topic for another day. This is not a lecture about object-oriented ontology. I'm just trying to spell out Latour's position. In any case, I think the modes of existence is a very promising project that I don't think people have really understood yet. I think it's going to take a couple more decades before people are writing about that as much as they're writing about actor network theory. When Latourians talk Latour, they're usually talking about actor network theory. It's only relatively rare that people talk about the modes of existence project. But it's one that Latour was very proud of, and it's one that he was working on as far back as 1987. So you can call it his late phase, but he was working on it for the last 35 years of his life, since age 40. So it's simultaneous with his earlier philosophy in a sense. Okay, let me go faster on my last 2 points. The copy of my book on Latour's politics was held up earlier. Bruno Latour, Reassembling the Political. The history behind that book is that the publisher asked me recommend someone to write a book on Latour's politics. And I thought about it for a few days. Who should I recommend to write this book? And then I decided I wanted to write the book myself. And I volunteered. And the reason I did that is because after decades of studying Latour, I wasn't really sure what his political views were. And Latour admitted to me later he wasn't really sure what his political views were either. And so I wanted to reconstruct them by rereading his work with a political eye. And what I just figured out is that Latour is actually a very important political theorist in the sense that he's a non-modern political theorist. What does non-modern mean? Well, in political thoughts in modern times, the basic framework of left-right is our basic political framework. How far to the left is somebody? How far to the right is somebody? Are they in the center? You meet somebody and you probably get some sense of how far left or right or how centrist they are. But this only goes back to the French Revolution, right? It referred to the sides of the assembly during the revolution. The more radical members were sitting to the left, the more conservative members to the right, and we have retained that terminology. But if you look at what left and right ultimately referred to, they ultimately refer to two opposite theories of human nature. Left politics is best characterized by the idea that humans are capable of goodness. Humans, if they are corrupted by society, not by nature. Humans have a right to throw out a bad government and set up a better one, because naturally we are free. Naturally, we do not exploit each other. And exploitation basically come from society. And so that we should work towards a revolution that removes those problems with society. And you find this idea in Rousseau, you find it in Marx, you find a variant of it in Jean-Luc, which includes property rights, which you don't find in Marx, and you find to a lesser extent in Rousseau. But what Rousseau, Marx, and Locke all have in common is the idea that a revolution is justified if the government is not treating people well. Because why? Because humans in nature were free. And so if we're not free under our current government, the government is doing something bad, and the government deserves to be replaced, even if violently sometimes. That's the left underpinning of leftist political thought. Now, the right simply inverts that. The right thinks of humans as a dangerous animal, of being essentially unimprovable, of being essentially sinful, essentially evil, essentially willing to do dark things if we do not have the threat of punishment hanging over us. The right tends to view international relations as a site of dog eat dog, where one country's gain is another country's loss. And so countries can afford to be rather expansionist and selfish in their foreign policies. In fact, they should be. And you find this, of course, in the likes of Hobbes, you find it in Machiavelli, you find it in the 20th century in Carl Schmitt. This idea that human nature is fixed, but it's not good, unlike the left. But the human nature is something evil, something we need to take seriously, and we need to fear other humans. And the government is basically there to protect us from other humans, not to make us happy. So the state is essentially reduced to a military and a police function, ideally. Okay, so how do we approach that if we are Latourians? Well, one thing to keep in mind is that both the left and the right are united by assuming that politics is a question of human nature. Is human nature good? Is human nature evil? Is human nature improvable? Is human nature constant across the centuries? These are the disputes that pit the left against the right. Well, for Latour, we also need to take non-human entities into consideration in the political sphere. He wrote a very important early article with Shirley Strum, the primatologist and baboon expert at the University of California, San Diego. Essentially, Shirley Strum took Latour out on one of her baboon watching expeditions. And the conclusion that they reached from this is that baboons are actually more social than humans, because baboons are always watching each other to see who's more powerful or less powerful on any given day. Baboons always stay with the group. Even if a baboon found a great source of food, they will leave that source of food if the other baboons are leaving, because they don't want to be alone. And so baboons live entirely inside society. And you can see this with dogs, with birds, with any animal that's not a solitary animal, wolves. They are even more social creatures than humans are. Now, what is it that humans do to attain some privacy and some stability in politics? We use inanimate objects. So baboons are worried every second about their place in the society. You and I don't have to worry every second about our place in society. We worry about it enough, I guess, but we don't worry about it constantly. Why? Because I wake up in the morning, I know my name. I know that this is my apartment because I rented it. I know that I have an identity as a philosophy professor, and I was invited to speak in India this morning. I have a title that was read before my lecture, Distinguished Professor of Philosophy, Southern California Institute of Architecture. I know my name. I've got a wedding ring, so I know I'm married. I know that I have a bank account with a certain amount of money in it. So there are all these things that stabilize my identity. I don't have to wake up every day in some kind of crisis, wondering whether I could die today, but I don't wake up every morning wondering if I'm going to die today, because I know other people will be obeying the traffic rules when I drive. I know that the food that I bought at the supermarket is probably not poisoned. There are all these institutions that make me feel confident in my safety and security, except in certain crisis periods, right? I lived through the Egyptian Revolution, and that was one of the situations I've been in where you could meet with a violent death if you do something stupid like go to a dangerous neighborhood during the revolution. Or, if you have an operation in a hospital, as I had in March, there was like a 1 in 10,000 chance I would die from the operation. Not a big chance, but some chance. Why did I do it then? Because I trust the doctor. I trust the institution of UCLA Hospital. All of these institutions allow me political stability and security. I'm pretty confident that my vote will be counted when I vote. So for Latour, politics is mostly about inanimate things. So human nature isn't really the point. Whether you think humans are naturally good or naturally evil becomes somewhat irrelevant if you take a Latourian approach to politics. What matters is the way you set up the infrastructure of non-human entities in such a way as to enable certain things to happen and prevent certain other things from happening. So I think that is probably a promising line of research for future political theory. And one reason I think people don't like that is that, especially in continental philosophy right now, there's this stress on the imagination. You get this from a lot of thinkers. You get this from Badiou, from Catherine Malabou, from the late Mark Fisher, from the new book by David Graeber and David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything. Actually, let me talk about Graeber and Wengrow. I don't know if that book is as famous in India as it is in the United States, where it's a bestseller. David Graeber was the anarchist anthropologist. He was involved in Occupy Wall Street. He's quite beloved on the American left, who died, unfortunately, 2 years ago of pancreatitis. But before he died, he had almost finished this book with his partner, David Wengrow, which styles itself to be a new history of humanity. The Dawn of Everything. It's a big, thick book. It takes a little while to read, but it's very interesting. It has a lot of new facts about human prehistory that I didn't know. And they also disagree with left and right in that book. They say there's a trap where you fall into either Rousseau or fall into Hobbes, right? Rousseau thinks humans are naturally nice. Hobbes thinks humans are naturally mean. And the alternative is no, humans are naturally imaginative. Humans can invent a new society for themselves. Their motivation in saying that, of course, is that they are anarchists. And they are influenced by Frederick Jameson's idea that it is easier to imagine the world ending than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. That's been a famous phrase in recent years. The idea that the reason we're stuck in capitalism is because people aren't imaginative enough. People should work hard to try to imagine a new system. That's Graeber and Wingrove, and a lot of other people. Now, the problem with this is that saying humans are basically imaginative, you're turning your politics into just another theory of human nature, even if it's different from saying humans are naturally good or humans are naturally evil. It's essentially a way of having or asking for a politics without constraints. And this is going to be even harder in the future than it was. But even if you go back into the past, you will see, for example, the role that geography played in history. And people we call political realists will talk about geography a lot. And we don't always like what they have to say. For instance, Henry Kissinger, who you could call a political realist, someone who is willing to do things that many people would consider immoral or illegal in order to attain what he considers to be real political goals. So, for instance, I was reading Henry Kissinger's analysis of the Korean War, and it's a typical realist analysis. Kissinger says the mistake in the Korean War made by the United States is that we shouldn't have tried to free all of Korea, right? Because that got China involved. When the United States Army decided to go all the way and try to recapture all of Korea from the communists, it meant that the UN and the United States armies went all the way to the border of China, which prompted China to intervene, and it helped North Korea counterattack to the current border. And the current border of North Korea is very bad for South Korea because, as you may know, Seoul, the capital of South Korea and a very important modern industrial city, is within shooting range of the border of North Korea. So if there is ever a war in Korea again, the city of Seoul, with all its millions of people, will be destroyed within the first 45 minutes, leading to millions of deaths, which is a very difficult political factor for anyone trying to change things on the Korean Peninsula. And so Kissinger has this idea that the United States should not have tried to free all of Korea. They should have gone maybe 2/3 up of the way, just far enough so that China didn't feel threatened. And that way, North Korea would still exist, but it would be a lot smaller. That's a good example of a realist political analysis, in the sense that Kissinger was trying to look at the constraints of reality in that situation. The constraint being that China was a powerful country, and we shouldn't have threatened China. Another example is Kissinger's view on the Ukraine war. Kissinger must be 97 or 98 years old now, but he's still weighing in on international affairs. And here's what he said about Ukraine. He said, Ukraine's proper role is to be a buffer state with Russia. Its proper role is not to be a European country. And you might think about that and say, well, that's offensive. How is it Henry Kissinger's place to say what Ukraine's proper role is? Ukrainians are an independent people. They can vote for what they want. Let them decide. If they want democracy, we should all defend them. This is the humanitarian position on Ukraine. But Kissinger's position is the realist one, which is we have to realize that Russia is still a power and Russia is going to be threatened if Ukraine is not an ally of Russia, and so we need to let Ukraine remain an ally of Russia. Basically, a similar position to Putin's own position. And so political realism is not always popular because it always side with democracy and human rights and freedom over what some people consider to be an impressive imperial power. You know, Kissinger was also involved in Chile in overthrowing the Allende government and replacing it with Pinochet, and he's been charged with crimes in some countries for that. How would Kissinger defend that? He would probably defend it by saying, look, it was the Cold War. Yes, Pinochet did some horrible things in Chile, but it's better for the world in the long run that Chile did not go communist. That's probably what Kissinger would say. I'm saying this because this is why political realism has a bad name with some people. Political realism seems to be seen as something that prevents good stuff from happening. Like, let's all get together and hold hands and ask for democracy and human rights everywhere, which is what we, on some level, we probably all want. But then there are certain things in reality that prevent us from that happening. And the political realists are the ones who say that's just the way it is. We have to deal with reality. However, there's some positive things having to do with a politics based on non-human things. And this brings me to the last point of the lecture, which has to do with climate politics. Climate politics is the ultimate proof of Latour's claim that politics isn't just about humans. Carbon dioxide is a major political actor now. Methane is a major political actor. Forests, permafrost, algae. All of these things now are obviously major political actors, and we have to take care of them, and we have to negotiate with them, Latour would say. We have to ask the Earth, how much fossil fuel can we take out of you and burn before we destroy the planet? And that is a job for scientists to try to figure out. How much permafrost can melt without destroying the planet? How many more forests do we need to plant? How much more can we fly in airplanes without destroying the atmosphere? Just as a personal anecdote here, I wasn't flying during the pandemic, of course, as most people weren't. Then last November, about a little over a year ago, I was invited to speak in Dubai. And I did it. I was very excited because I hadn't had the chance to fly anywhere to speak in 2 years. So I flew to Dubai, but now they are doing that thing where they put on your airplane tickets how much CO2 you are personally creating by flying. And I calculated it. And in order to make up for my flight to Dubai in terms of carbon dioxide, from Los Angeles to Dubai, I would have to plant 3 trees that live 75 years to cancel my carbon dioxide. And from flying Dubai back to Los Angeles, I'd have to plant another 3 trees. So I should have planted 6 trees that could live for 75 years in order just to cancel out the CO2 I personally produced from flying from Los Angeles to Dubai. And I think what they're trying to do is make us think twice before we fly, and it works, right? That we are personally damaging the atmosphere every time we travel like that. So we are all becoming more ecologically aware. Oil-burning cars are being phased out. Some people think electrical cars aren't that much better because the amount of CO2 that's needed to produce the batteries for electric cars, or the environmental damage done by the building those batteries, might not give us much of an improvement. That's a debate ongoing. But California, where you will not be able to buy a gas car after it's either 2030 or 2035, and no more oil drilling will be allowed here. There's a lot of oil in Los Angeles. People don't realize a lot of oil wells pumping around the city. That is going to be phased out. And I'm getting some interesting comments in the window about carbon credits, so you guys can check Bill Wells' comments if you want. They're very helpful. So Latour became obsessed in his final years, and rightly so, with climate politics, with Gaia. Gaia being the idea, not that the world is a giant organism, that's not what Lovelock believed, but the idea that the climate is something produced by living organisms. That oxygen, of course, is not something that was naturally found on Earth. Oxygen was the waste product of an earlier set of organisms, and that the ancestors of humans evolved in order to be able to breathe oxygen without dying, because oxygen is a very toxic and volatile gas. And so all living things help adjust the climate. And so we need to look at the interactions between all species for this, as well as including plants and including non-organic technologies. So Gaia became the center of Latour's thinking. And this is why Donald Trump became central to his thinking at the end, because he saw Trump as a perfect counterexample. He says, as horrible as Trump seems to be to many people, he is a rare political innovator. In what sense was Trump an innovator? Well, a lot of people call Trump a fascist. Latour says, no, Trump is not a fascist. That's an anachronism. Fascism had to do with the combination of industry, mass technology, and mass media. We're beyond that. He said, Trump is not a fascist, Trump is an escapist. Because what are the 2 big issues facing the world right now? Environmental damage and refugees. We already have a lot of refugees around the world from wars. Just wait to see how many refugees we have once climate change gets going and certain countries are flooded all the time or can't grow food anymore. That's when we're going to have a major refugee problem. that has to be solved, unless we just want to let all these people die from these countries that will no longer be inhabitable. And near India, you have the Maldives. I went to the Maldives for my honeymoon. Beautiful place, beautiful scuba diving. My understanding is that the Maldives know that they are doomed as a country because of rising sea levels, and they have been negotiating with both India and Sri Lanka for citizenship rights in the future. Maybe you know more about that than I do. When I visited the Maldives in 2013, I don't think it had been decided where they were going to go, but they want to go to either India or Sri Lanka because there won't be a Maldives 40 years from now or 50 years from now. And that's going to happen to a lot of countries. What about Bangladesh? Bangladesh is really going to flood. What about the Dutch? I mean, the Dutch have a lot of series of walls, but how much longer can those walls hold if the sea gets too high? So there are going to be some countries with a lot of trouble. Here where I live on the Pacific Ocean coast in Long Beach, California, we could have problems. All beaches in the world are supposed to be gone by 100 years from now. So what does Trump do? Trump functions by simply pretending none of that is happening. He pretends that climate change isn't happening. He pretends that the immigration problem is a problem for us. You know, it's the people can stay where they are. It's not our problem, according to Trump. We don't have to let anybody in. So it's a way of trying to isolate the American public from reality. Whereas Latour's whole point is we need to face reality in politics. Politics has to face the real. And the predominant real of our time is the climate real. And there's one more thing about the climate that interests Latour, which is that he notices, somewhat embarrassedly, that global warming skeptics and COVID skeptics are using some of the same arguments against science that Latour and his colleagues used against science in the early days. Right? That you have to trace all the actors to see who decided that COVID was dangerous and who decided that the COVID vaccines will work. And you always have to open up a space for controversy. These are the things that Latour and his colleagues always did with respect to scientists. But now that the uneducated sectors of the population mostly are denying, either COVID deniers or they're climate change deniers, Latour is embarrassed to recognize that maybe he helped cause part of this problem. And so now Latour wants to look at science as an institution, meaning that, okay, a scientist can't just look in a microscope and say, I found global warming, I found global warming. Because global warming is detected indirectly through lots of different measurements of sea level rises and CO2, lots of monitoring stations around the world, lots of debates over atmospheric chemistry. And yes, you're always going to find 2 or 3% of scientists who don't believe global warming is happening the way others do. Because you're always going to have 2 or 3% of people in any fields who disagree with the consensus. But Latour, in his later years, was trying to get us to trust again the institution of science, that it's the best thing we have as humans to try to detect what the real problems out there are in the world and how to respond to them. Not that science is an infallible judgment on anything, because it's not. Scientific theories change over time. Scientists are fallible humans. Scientists sometimes have political motives, yes, but we don't have a better method of coming in contact with reality than science in most cases. And so that's the irony, is that Latour saw himself at the end as a defender of the fragility of science, instead of someone who's attacking the absolutism of science. And that has a lot to do with the way things changed during his professional life from the early 1970s till his death this year. All right, it looks like I went an hour and 25 minutes, and I'm sorry for that, but I will stop here. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Harman. I'm sure that that was the sort of lecture that I think, provokes your mind in so many different ways, with so many different kinds of introspections, that it takes a bit of time to, have all that processed and, recorded properly. So I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions, a lot of observations, a lot of comments that will emanate and generate from his wonderful and vivacious talk. But in order to kind of take up this very brief Q&A session, and I hope I have just one request to all of you, to keep your questions and your observations a bit brief so that we can follow up with the other ones. And I would be a bit partial and take up the first question myself, since this is largely thanks to the generosity and patronage of our Honorable Vice Chancellor. We have opened up this Center for Posthuman Research in Bankura University. So I would like to, ask the first question, which I think is, of course, a generative question from your talk, Graham. And that is this, that, we've read very, frequently about, Latour's position vis-a-vis Donna Haraway, and the turn of the non-modern towards the post-human. And there was this particular essay by T. Hugh Crawford that kind of, talks about this particular turn. I would like to know from you that, when we talk about this political kind of, blanket obliteration of the non-participation of the non-humans by humans. So how do you locate the idea of, agency, affect, in conjunction with the actor network theory? What kind of, futurist projection would you locate vis-a-vis Latour? And what kind of, way forward would you recommend from your own reading? Over to you, Professor Harman. Yeah.
It's interesting because although Latour did not write as explicitly about the post-human as Haraway, who was his longtime friend and colleague, I think his philosophy clearly implies at least a somewhat pro-post-human attitude, in the sense that Latour's philosophy asks us to erase any neat divide between humans and non-humans. And so this immediately suggests that humans have always been hybrids to begin with, right? The fact that we raise domestic livestock, we have cows, pigs, and sheep. And because of raising cows, pigs, and sheep, we were exposed to new bacteria. Our immune systems were altered. Our bodies were altered by our diets, also plant diets for vegetarians like me. The kind of food you grow will change the kind of society you have. The kind of, there's this book, Carbon Democracy by Timothy Mitchell, another fan of Latour, where Timothy Mitchell writes, you can't just look at capitalism as a money-generating thing. You have to look at what materials capitalism is producing. So if your country is producing oil, that will lead to different social features than if your country is producing cotton or producing diamonds or whatever the main export of your country is. That you become a hybrid of whatever it is you do or whatever it is you work with. To become a dog owner is to become a different person from one who is not a dog owner. And Haraway writes about that when she writes about companion species. Haraway writes beautifully about her dog. And so all of that is there in Latour. In all my years of conversations with him, I don't remember him bringing up post-humanity the way Haraway does with regularity, but I can't imagine Latour being opposed in any strict way to the post-human. The key, I think, is the fact that he focuses on hybridity, and I'm with him on this because there's a lot of talk these days about a singularity in artificial intelligence, right? That there will come one day when suddenly artificial intelligence is smarter than humans and it will take over and it might kill us all. That's the nightmare scenario many people are talking about. I think that's very unlikely. I think what's more likely is a more gradual integration of non-human technologies into humans. And so it might not be as controversial as we think. So for example, to have a computer make decisions in warfare, like to have a robot decide who it can shoot and who it cannot shoot in a war, that would be tremendously controversial, of course, because then you're taking the agency directly away from humans. Or even in the case of driverless cars, right? They've got to program an algorithm in for how much should you protect the driver of the car and how much should you protect the pedestrian who might be hit by the car. That's a famous controversy. Also, the racial part of it, because in the United States, there's a complaint that the cameras that recognize pedestrians crossing have a better job of seeing white people a better time seeing white people than black people, which implies that black people are more likely to be hit and killed by driverless cars. So there are all these political issues. But what if instead of that, it's that you're providing soldiers with computer assistance? so that a computer in a battle is advising a soldier on who to shoot and who not, but the soldier has the final call. I could see a case where that actually makes warfare safer, that a computer can figure out somebody's likely a civilian, don't shoot, faster than a human can figure that out. Or where we all have the chance to add a memory chip to our brain, not replace our brain with a computer brain, but just add a memory chip, just like I add glasses when I'm reading, right? I'm still myself when I put the glasses on, but I'm somehow a different person. And humans have always done this. Humans have changed their size and shape because of their diets. Humans became different when we started wearing clothing. When we started wearing winter clothing, we were able to live in different climates, and so on and so forth. So I think it's going to be more business as usual, even if a bit faster when it comes to post-humanity. There are going to be a variety of things that we choose to purchase or to add to our bodies. And so I don't think there's going to be one day when we're no longer humans. I think there's going to come a time when we notice a big difference between people of 300 years ago. And this is measured by the fact that every generation feels further from its parents' generations than before. So for thousands of years, every human life was basically the same. But then over the last few centuries, that's no longer true. My world is not the same as my grandparents' world. And even my nephew's world is different from my world. And that's going to go faster and faster. And that poses a lot of challenges for the teaching profession. The fact that now, for instance, it's often harder to get students to read books than it was, because they're used to reading PDFs on their pads, right? On their tablets. And that's just a different learning style that we have to get used to. And they tend to multitask more than we did. So I think that's part of our step towards the post-human. I think we've always been becoming post-human, I would say. And I think Latour would agree with that too.
True. Thank you so much for that, Graham. I would like to mention that our Honorable Vice Chancellor has a question, an observation. So over to you, sir. Yeah. Sir, are you there? Yeah.
Actually, I believe that we should rather pass it on to others who have some very significant questions.
Do you have a question? Shukendu, just inform me. Like, if you have.
About the secular occasionalist that he has described in his book, Prince of Networks, in connection with Latour. But I believe that there should be opportunity for all of those who are attending this lecture so seriously and have already put forward their questions in the chat box, and there are too many. So I believe that this can be.
We will proceed one by one with the chat box now.
Oh yes, right.
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much.
I think that would be better because they have been listening for so long.
Okay, sir.
Thank you, Shubha.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Professor, but I take this opportunity to express my gratitude to Professor Graham Harman. Actually, it was a very significant lecture for all of us. So I think we'll have time we'll have time to discuss all of this later. Okay, let's go for some other questions.
Right, sir. So, Professor Harman, would you want me to read out the questions, or would you read it directly from the chat box? You may answer them serially also, as you wish.
Let me first thank the Vice Chancellor in return and say I hope to meet you all my next trip to India, whenever it is. I've been there 4 times, but it's been over 10 years since my last one. So I look forward to my next visit there and look forward to seeing your university. You can read the questions for me because I don't know which ones to choose in the chat box.
Yeah, there are a lot of observations, I think, so I'm skipping them. I'll just come to the main questions that are there because there's been quite a lot of them. Let me just have a check. Yeah, the first question, I think, which is, I think this is a very proper question. Somebody, K, I think I'm not reading out the name properly right now.
West Africa.
Yeah, from West Africa. So wants to know the differences of actor and object.
Yes. The actor for Latour has to do something. It's not an actor unless it's actually doing something right now, and it's nothing more than its actions. An object in object-oriented ontology doesn't need to be doing anything right now. It might be sleeping. It might be not currently acting. It's at least possible that there's an object that is not currently having an effect on anything else, whereas that's impossible for Latour. And this is what Aristotle was talking about when he talked about potentiality. The master house builder might not be building a house right now, but he's still a master house builder because he has the knowledge that he can start building right away anytime he wants. And in Latour's philosophy, there's not really any way to account for that because a thing is only what it is in this moment.
Right. Helmut has a question which is related. I think it's a very basic question, but you might choose to attempt it, which is related to object-oriented ontology. So would you want to answer that, Professor Harman?
Sure. Object-oriented ontology goes back to the late 1990s, and it's the name for the kind of philosophy I do, which takes objects to be primary, objects in a wide sense, like Latour's actors. So it includes humans, non-humans, numbers, fictional characters, contradictions. And it's an attempt to discuss the interaction between these objects, also in terms of the way they hide from each other. So for Latour, there's no hiding. That's because I come from a Heideggerian background, unlike Latour. And in Heidegger's philosophy, of course, we can never get a direct contact with anything. Things are always partly veiled, partly hidden from us. And that has survived in object-oriented ontology in the form of saying that objects can never be fully manifested to other objects. But it's not only humans who can't see other objects directly. Objects cannot interact with each other directly. So obviously, when I look at a cotton ball, I'm not understanding everything about the cotton. I'm only seeing the color and the feel of it and the light weight of it in my hands. But when fire touches cotton and burns it, the fire is also not interacting with all of the cotton. It's only interacting with the flammability of the cotton. So it's not just the human mind that is unable to get to reality. Any relation at all is unable to get the full reality that it's relating with. So that's something you find in object-oriented ontology that you don't find in Latour, and you don't even find it in Kant, because in Kant's philosophy, the noumena are something that simply affects the human mind. The human mind is unable to reach the things in themselves, whereas in object-oriented ontology, even the things themselves cannot reach the things in themselves. Causal interactions are already partly hidden from each other. And are its limitations appropriate? I would say yes, because I would say there is no way for one thing to be totally accessible to a relation to something else. Any relation is only going to partially interact with the things it's relating to. So that's the basis of that intuition.
The next question is related to the Latourian views on politics, and the person who has asked this question has wanted to know it with reference to the current situation in Iran, the political situation in Iran.
You must mention the name also.
Sir, the names are given, in acronym format, so I'm not being able to.
No, Jonathan Chamans and many others are there.
Yeah, it's not coming in my screen, sir, that way. Like only the initials are coming, so I'm not getting to know their backgrounds.
Oh, yes, right.
Coming to the questions directly. Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Okay, the question about revolutions, particularly the current Iranian one. Well, Latour was opposed to the traditional conception of revolution, which is that you're tearing everything down and starting from scratch, because that never really happens, right? Any revolution will always leave certain of the old institutions intact. So we had the American Revolution in the 1770s and 80s, but we still retained some British institutions such as British law and other British institutions of that sort states, even after the revolution. And that's going to be true anywhere where this happens. I think sometimes the critique is made of Latour from the left that he only allows for reform, right? He only allows for small reforms, not for large revolutions. But actually, you could have pretty big changes, maybe not quite revolutionary changes. Let's call them renovations. So let's say you wanted to do something big to change the United States. You wouldn't necessarily need a revolution, meaning throw out the whole government, throw out the whole constitution, arrest all the politicians. That could be destabilizing in a bad way. but you might be able to do something more than just elect the Democrats next time or elect the Republicans next time. You might, for example, be able to change the role of the Federal Reserve, or to make some major change to the legal system, or to guarantee equal pay for women for comparable jobs, or give every Black person $1 million to make up for the sufferings of slavery. There are some big things you could do that wouldn't quite be revolution level, but that could very much change the United States as we know it. And so I think Latour would probably focus on those medium-sized changes, as it were, rather than tearing everything down and starting from scratch. So, for instance, look at Iraq. The decision was made after Saddam Hussein's government fell to remove all members of the Ba'ath Party from the Iraqi army, kind of like denazification after World War II. So Donald Rumsfeld and some others in Bush's government just wanted to kick all those people out of the army. Well, it sounds nice, right? It sounds nice to get all of Saddam's people out of the Iraqi army, but it turned out not to be such a good idea, because that meant there was a large number of people who had an incentive to start their own army to fight the occupation, right? So all of Saddam's ex-military officers were commanding ISIS or were commanding an insurgency, and so it simply made it impossible. It might not have been a good idea. I mean, yes, it's kind of a bad compromise and hold your nose to leave all of Saddam's people in the army, but it would have been a more practical thing to do, I think. And you can see that sometimes in political revolutions. Now, in the case of Iran, I wish Latour were still here to talk about it. And I'm not sure if he made any comments about Iran at the end of his lifetime. He was too ill, so probably not. But I think you can make an anti-modernist critique of the current Iranian government, right? Which is that it's an authoritarian religious government. And Latour would see, even though the Iranian regime seems very medieval in terms of some of their punishments and some of their backwards views, in a sense, they're very modernist because they're totalitarian. They try to control all aspects of society. They're not just the government trying to run the country for their own interest. They're also trying to shape the brains of everyone in Iran and turn them into very hardcore Shia Muslims and not let them do things that flout that. And so you could make a very strong Latourian case against the current Iranian government that authoritarianism, religious authoritarianism, is a form of modernity, and the networks should be freed from that, right? That we should allow more plurality within Iran. We should allow people to experiment with their own networks. And Latour, of course, was someone who supported democratic movements. He wasn't a left-wing revolutionary, but I think for sure he would have supported Iran's revolutionary movement in terms of the protests. I'm just guessing about that, but it's a pretty convinced guess. I'm pretty sure about that.
True. The next question, I think, is a question that many of us might have in mind, including me. So somebody has asked that who have been the authors that have most influenced your thinking the most? So, yeah.
Philosophically, it was Heidegger at first. I spent most of my 20s mastering Heidegger, reading everything he had ever written. And Heidegger is still an important philosopher to me, despite his political baggage of having been a Nazi. But there are some problems with his philosophy. And these are problems that Latour helped me solve. One of them is that Heidegger didn't have much to say about specific objects. Heidegger is interested in being, is not so interested in individual beings. Latour talks a lot about individual beings, like Adidas shoes and computers and anthrax, bacilli and things. So Latour allows for the curiosity about individual objects that I've always had. Also, Latour has a sense of humor that Heidegger usually lacks. I was talking once with Gerard de Vries, who's maybe the biggest expert on Latour in the Netherlands. He's about Latour's age. And I asked him, what drew you to Latour in the first place? And he said, Latour was the only philosopher I knew with a sense of humor. And it's true, Latour is very funny, both in writing and he was in person as well. Very joking man. And so he made philosophy fun. And that's part of the reason I was drawn to him. Latour was also very open to young people and also very open to women. And so the circles surrounding Latour were very multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-age group, multi-gender. And so there was a kind of fun atmosphere around Latour. It was a very open society around him that you don't always find in the academic world. And there were people from all countries in the world around Latour. And so it was just always a lot of fun to be around him. But in terms of other authors I read, along with Heidegger, there was Jose Ortega y Gasset, Ortega for short, a partly forgotten Spanish philosopher of the early 20th century who has a lot in common with Heidegger, but who is a wonderful writer. I would say he influenced my writing the most. He very nearly won the Nobel Prize for Literature as a philosopher, died in 1955 of cancer, but he influenced my style a lot. And there are others, but those are the two main ones. And then the older I get, the more I like Aristotle. You have to be middle-aged to really appreciate Aristotle, I think. When you're young, he's not flashy enough, but the older you get, the more wisdom you see in Aristotle.
Right, Graham. The next question concerns Latour's idea of translation and meditation. Someone wants to know if you could please elaborate on that and how these ideas radicate your understanding of the social.
All right. Latour has a famous phrase that says, no transport without transformation, which is that if you move something from one place to another, it's going to change. It can still remain somewhat identical, but there have to be changes. So, for instance, Shakespeare wrote his plays in Elizabethan England, late 1500s, early 1600s. You can still put on a Shakespeare play in your city in India in 2022, and I'm sure you do sometimes, because Shakespeare is a world classic now. But obviously, the performance is going to be a bit different, right? You're going to maybe adapt the costumes and the staging to your own context in some way. Shakespeare's plays might have a certain different meaning in an Indian context of 21st century as opposed to an Elizabethan context of the 16th century. So you have to translate. Everything is a translation. And mediation belongs to the same family of terms, that for one thing to go from one place to another needs a mediator. So I was talking about how do politics make contact with neutrons. That had to be mediated by the atomic bomb project. The reason neutrons meet with politics is because there is a political use of neutrons in causing atomic fission. Now, that's going to change how we see neutrons, of course. Neutrons used to be seen as a harmless and minor scientific discovery. Suddenly, they became one of the most important scientific facts, since slow neutron fission was the secret to the atomic bomb. And that will happen with any mediation. That if you meet someone through a third person, that third person is going to change the character of your meeting with that other person. So a lot of times you become friends with someone simply because you were introduced to them through a pre-existing friend who was very dear to you and you trust their judgment, right? Or I tended to be very close to my youngest brother in childhood. And so if he likes something, I tend to think I'm going to like it too, whether it's a movie or a food. And so anytime he says something positive, it mediates it for me. It makes me see it positively, at least at first, until I make my own decision about it. Latour thinks this is inevitable, that there is no way to see reality directly. Even scientists have to use certain instruments to allow them to see the world. So we are getting these beautiful photographs now of the universe through the James Webb Space Telescope. But the James Webb Space Telescope has to process these images and make certain decisions because it's seeing infrared. It's not actually seeing all these beautiful color photos that we are seeing on Facebook. And so there's a lot of mediation going on when that happens. People are having to make certain decisions about how the infrared light maps onto color vision light that humans like to use. So translation and mediation are absolutely essential for Latour. There is no way to make direct contact with anything, and he's especially concerned about this in cases of knowledge, because Latour's first study as an anthropologist of science was to study the laboratory in San Diego at the Jonas Salk Biotechnology Institute, and he was interested in seeing how scientists depict the facts that they discover. How does a scientist discover a fact? Which instruments are they using to figure it out? And the instruments aren't just things like test tubes and microscopes. It also includes things like paper and blackboards and computers. These are also instruments we use. So he's very much the philosopher of translation.
Right. The next question is a rather technical question. I think it's part of the generic discussion that you were having. Does new realism intersect speculative realism?
Yes. By new realism, that term usually refers to the kind of philosophy done by Marcus Gabriel in Germany and Maurizio Ferraris in Italy. And they are both realists. They focus, though, on the real as something knowable, right? The reason that they are realists is because they think we can get that knowledge, get the knowledge of the real, whether through science or through some other means. Marcus Gabriel and Maurizio Ferraris are very interested in obtaining knowledge about the real. Now, in speculative realism, which is a somewhat looser grouping, you have me and you have Ray Brassier, who are almost polar opposites in some respects. And yet we both have this Kantian side, which is that you cannot really gain direct access to the real, that there will always be a gap between science and reality. Even though Brassier is very much a pro-science philosopher, he is quick to always, I like science too, but Brassier is someone who thinks science has the privileged word on reality, but he doesn't think it will ever coincide with reality, because every scientific representation we have of the world always turns out to be false. And that's not something you get from Gabriel and Ferraris as much. Gabriel and Ferraris are mostly interested in fighting relativism. Ferraris was a disciple of Derrida originally and of Gianni Vattimo, and he reacted against that at some point and said he doesn't like the relativism of these thinkers. He makes a good point. He says, if you're sick, you're going to go to the best modern hospital. You're not going to go to an astrologer, probably. You're not going to go to a witch doctor. You're not going to go to the healer of some tribe who you claim's views are just as good as ours. You're going to choose the best modern hospital you can go to. So he claims it's hypocritical to be a relativist and say that all cultures are equal. And Marcus Gabriel is similar to that. Whereas I think I'm a little more open to relativism. I believe there's one reality, but I think our means of getting at that reality are so imperfect that we have to be very cautious about judging the difference between cultures. And so I'm like Latour, I'm a bit more open to non-Western medicines and rituals and things like that as possible ways of accessing the truth. Because I believe in reality more than I believe in truth. That's another way of putting it. I think there is a reality. I don't think anything we say about reality arbitrarily is equally good, but I don't think anyone really has it right. It's impossible to have it just right. And so we need to be a little more respectful of other approaches. Now, I have to admit, I'm not very supportive of some of the crazy conspiracy theories we get in the United States now. Some of these really sicken me. You know, the QAnon theory and the theory that Bill Gates is putting microchips in the COVID vaccine to spy on all of us. And I get very frustrated with these because I think it's really degenerating the political sphere in the United States. We didn't have this before. But for the most part, I think speculative realism tends to be a little more open to strange approaches to the world than new realism is. But I should also say that Gabriel and Ferraris are my friends. We overlap in the sense that we have a lot in common. And I communicate them with both of them fairly regularly. They're nice people. So there is some relation.
We'll have two more questions. I guess the rest are in the nature of observations and, like phrasal comments and all that. This particular question mentions, is there any difference between built architecture and architecture on paper in terms of distinction between calendar time and clock time?
Very interesting.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, I have to get a little into my book here then. I wrote a book, I just published a book this summer, Architecture and Objects, my first book on architecture after spending, this is now my 7th year in an architecture school. One of the first things I learned when I entered the architectural world, and architects know this, but most people don't, I always thought that architects get a commission, they design a building, and they build the building. That almost never happens. Only a very, very, very tiny % of an architect's work is designing buildings that are actually built. You enter competitions and lose most of the time, right? There might be 3,000 people in a competition and only one wins. And even if they win, they're not going to build exactly what they designed. They're going to have to compromise for various reasons with the people commissioning the project. So paper architecture is a large part of architecture at any company, but especially in academia. The other thing is that a lot of paper architecture projects have a major impact on the profession. So one of my favorite articles in architecture is Jeffrey Kipnis's article on Rem Koolhaas, where he talks about how Rem Koolhaas has an unusually large number of designs that were never built that have still had a huge impact on architecture. One of those was his losing entry to build the Tate Modern in London, which was the competition was won by Herzog and de Meuron. Rem Koolhaas lost the competition, and yet his design for it is very influential. because of the novel features that it had. So the difference between paper and built architecture, there's a lot more paper architecture in the field than there is built architecture. Now, in terms of calendar time and clock time, I've written about that in a couple of my books, and I don't even remember where at the moment. Clock time has to do with the time that we are experiencing in the moment, right? The fact that things seem to be flowing. And we can have clock time without any calendar time happening at all, right? So you can feel 10 years of your life passing and then realize at the end of 10 years, wow, I haven't really made any progress at all. I've been stuck in the same rut for 10 years. So there hasn't really been any calendar time in that sense. Yeah, there's been calendar time in the sense that it was 2012 and now it's 2022. But you could still say, wow, my own life, I've wasted 10 years. Nothing really changed. I'm doing exactly the same stuff and I'm not really improving at it. That would be an example of calendar time. Well, I would say that the actual construction of built architecture does make a cut in calendar time, right? Because once something is actually constructed, the city has changed, even if in a small way. The city has been reorganized. And then there's also the fact that certain buildings resist calendar time simply by being so permanent, so monumental. This is what Aldo Rossi, the Italian architect, writes about in Architecture of the City, the importance of monuments. First of all, modernism in architecture often had a functionalist spirit, right? That the form of an architectural work should express its function somehow. There shouldn't be unnecessary ornament or history attached to it. And then in the 60s, people started pushing back against that. One of the reasons was that Rossi pointed out that, especially in Italy, where he's from, where they're surrounded by history, few buildings keep the same function for their entire lifespan, right? Even SCI-Arc, where I work, it's 110 years old, the building. It was originally a train station. And then once it went bankrupt as a train station, it became a damaged building where homeless people were living and drug addicts were hiding out to use drugs. And then finally, in the year 2000, it became an architecture school. So it still looks basically the same as the train station, but it has a totally different function now. And yet that building has outlasted the train station function. It will probably outlast the architecture school function. We'll probably move at some point. And so there's something monumental about it because it's been around for more than a century, which is, by American standards, that's old. I know that's not old by India standards or Italian standards, but 100 years is a pretty old building in America, a pretty new country. So also, Rossi points out that some buildings never had a clear function in the first place. And this is what monuments often are. What is the function of the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C.? Well, you could say it's to honor George Washington, our first president. Yes, but it's more than that, right? And yes, you can go up there and get a nice view, but that's not really the function of it either. In a way, the real function of it is as a visual landmark. So you can always tell where you are in Washington just by looking up. And if you see the Washington Monument, it orients you. And you might think about George Washington when you see it, but you probably won't. I usually don't. When I'm in Washington and look at the Washington Monument, it takes me a few minutes to remember that George Washington is the person this honors. I'm usually thinking of it as a architectural ornament that makes the city look interesting and helps orient me. So I think built architecture definitely makes more of a cut in calendar time than paper architecture does, because it becomes a collective reality when it's built. Whereas the Washington Monument on paper, before it was built, was known to a small committee of judges and known to a small group of architects. So I don't know if that was the kind of answer you wanted, but that's how I would approach it.
Well, my co-compere has a question for you, Professor Harman. Mr. Dash, are you there?
Yes, Professor Harman, thank you for your talk. I have found that Latour is talking about experimental metaphysics in politics of nature.
Yes.
So I was thinking, how does Latour's political utopia that we find in politics of nature critique the metaphysics of the old constitution? This is one question. And another associated question is this political utopia going to cure the sufferings of modernity? What do you think?
Did he actually use the word utopia? If he did, I've forgotten, and I would be surprised.
Yes, political utopia.
Oh, I didn't know he used that term. I must have forgotten it, because I would think he would oppose that term, being an anti-modernist that he is. But the politics he discusses in Politics of Nature is very much a politics. This is a period when Latour thinks that the truth is something that is attained politically through an interacting network of scientists, moralists, parliamentarians, politicians, all kinds of people coming together to politically institute the truth. And the way he did it in that book, first of all, he showed more openness to mystery than he did in his previous books. Because Latour previously was someone who sees that there's no problem really getting at the truth. You just look at what a thing does, and that's the truth about it. In Politics of Nature, he becomes a little more interested in the fact that scientists are trying to discover new truths that we don't know yet. He never quite becomes Heidegger because Latour doesn't think that the truth is permanently hidden. He thinks it's temporarily hidden, and the scientists can find it step by step. But for now, it's unknown. And so scientists are one part of that project. They're trying to discover new truths that the society then has to come to terms with. So, for example, COVID. COVID was a new thing that scientists discovered, and we had to rearrange our societies for a while to deal with it, and that was controversial, but everyone, I think, admits society had to do something to stop the spread of COVID. We didn't have enough hospital resources to just let it spread, so we had to do some social distancing and masking. But then also moralists can do that, according to Latour. So the most recent example in the United States would be gay marriage, in the sense that if you go back to 2008, not that long ago, when Barack Obama was running for president the first time. Remember, Obama's a Democrat, he's a liberal. And when Obama was asked if he supports gay marriage in 2008, he said, no, marriage is between a man and a woman. For gay couples, we can have civil partnerships that are recognized in some way. Well, now, 14 years later, you are never going to find a Democrat say that. Any Democrat is going to be 100% gay rights. That changed in 14 years. How did that happen? There's different theories about how it happens. Now, the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage throughout the country. So even very conservative states that are highly Republican, who don't like gay culture, have to accept gay marriages as legal. And that's in a very fast period of time. And usually the way you think of new truths evolving or new moral views evolving is that the old generation dies off and the younger people are more tolerant. That apparently is not what happened here. Even old people in America increased their support for gay marriage in about 10 years. And it's still not entirely explained. One of the theories is that since more gay people came out in the open and said they were gay, everybody realized that they knew more gay people than they thought. And they realized these are good people. So let's give them the same rights as everybody else. They're not hurting anybody. That would be an example of what Latour calls the moralists, right? So for many years, you had gay activists saying gay people should have the right to marriage in the United States. And the general public was saying, no, why should they? It doesn't make any sense. Marriage is mostly for producing children. It should be a heterosexual marriage. But these moralists kept pushing and pushing and pushing at it until finally, whether you agree with it or not, the society came to agree. The majority of the US society now agrees with gay marriage, and it's a law now. It's always possible the Supreme Court will take it away, but for now it's an established right. So Latour gives that function to the moralists. The moralists are the ones who figure out that things are not fair, that nobody ever realized were not fair. So, for instance, American sports are dominated by Black athletes, especially basketball. And yet for many years, you would see no Black coaches, coaching teams. All of these wonderful Black players always had white coaches. And it just seemed natural to all of us, right? Because it had always been that way. And then some people started protesting, hey, this isn't fair. Don't you think Black people should have the right to coach teams as well, especially if many of them are among the best players? And now we have a situation where I think more than half the coaches in the NBA are minorities, because it finally caught up with the ratio of players somewhat. That would be another example of morality. Somebody seeing an exploitation that nobody else saw. And Latour in the Politics of Nature is more open to that. In early career, Latour didn't really like moralists. Latour was of the opinion that if you have a moral principle and do nothing to put it into reality, that's kind of pathetic. Your moral principles are worthless unless you can bring them into reality. The Politics of Nature, no, he changes his mind and says the moralists have a real place in politics. They have to alert us to things that we're not sensitive enough to. Who is being exploited? What might there be in the future that we don't realize now? I'll give you an example. a few people are starting to say children should be allowed to vote. Why? Because the government is not stopping climate change enough, and it's the children who are going to be more affected. So shouldn't children have the right to vote for green politicians if they want, since we're going to be dead before the worst things happen with global warming, but children won't be. They'll be around to see it. So maybe children should be allowed to vote. And that would have sounded completely ridiculous to us 20 years ago, and maybe still sounds completely ridiculous to some people now. But I can see the point of it now, thinking it over, that maybe at least 12-year-olds or 10-year-olds can think enough to vote for a politician, maybe, because politics are affecting them. In the United States, we had a situation where the voting age was 21, and then we realized we were sending 18-year-olds to die in the Vietnam War, even though they didn't have the right to vote, which is completely unfair. Nobody realized that until some moralists started talking about how immoral that was, sending 18-year-olds to die when they can't even vote for the war. And so finally we added to our Constitution that 18-year-olds must be allowed to vote since they're allowed to fight in wars. And things like that. So Latour thinks moralists are an important part, just as scientists are an important part of politics. And as far as who are the political outcasts, there are going to be political outcasts in any system. So in the United States right now, Nazis are political outcasts. They have free speech and they have freedom of the press, but nobody wants Nazis on their platform. Nobody wants Nazis on Twitter or on Facebook or coming to their meetings. So is there some discrimination against Nazis? Well, yes, but we would say it's a good discrimination because they are calling for violence against certain groups. We don't want that. Well, maybe there will come a time in the future when the government decides maybe it's actually better to let the Nazis come and speak at political meetings instead of having them organize in secret, something like that. Maybe we'll change our idea about that in the future. Or child sex abusers right now are the most hated people in America. Who are the people in America who everybody hates? Child sex abusers. They are the national villains. They're put on watch lists. They have to record where they're living so all the parents can know where they're living once they get out of prison. They are considered the number one public enemy. All right, I can see that. And yet you might meet some psychologists who say, actually, it's an illness and it should be treated more like an illness. Treat them like mentally unhealthy people instead of like criminals. That's what some psychologists might say. Well, right now, the American public treats them more as criminals and villains. We don't care if it's a psychological problem because everybody wants to protect kids from these horrible abusers. But what Latour says in Politics of Nature is excluding people like that from the community has to be temporary because it's always possible there will be new information in the future. Right? It's always possible there will be new information that causes us to view different people differently and allow them into the political sphere, such as children. So maybe in 20 years, we say, of course, children should vote. Why wouldn't we let children vote? Climate change is affecting them. It's really an injustice that children could never vote before. And children of the future might say, can you believe kids couldn't vote in the past? And that seems natural to us today, just like it seemed natural to people 200 years ago that women couldn't vote. And now it seems ridiculous to us if women can't vote. It's because a small group of women and some men had to stand up and say it's unfair. Latour says that's why no group should be permanently excluded. Any exclusion politically must only be temporary. There may be some reason in the future to let a group back in or even to kick a group out. So those are some of my ideas about that.
Yeah.
Professor Harman?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. I think that answers Shukendu's question. And I think the final question for today, I think this would be that sort of question with which we can round the session off. It would come to a proper end. Though I don't think a lecture like this would have an end because we would love to go on and on, but yes, because of this constraint in time, we would have to put it to a formal end. The question is, what do you think is Latour's most significant, contribution or legacy of Latour's philosophy, according to you?
The phrase, "we have never been modern." I think his diagnosis of modernity is the best one we have. And I think the reason Latour is going to be read in philosophy for centuries to come is because philosophy will eventually need to get beyond the modern framework in which there are basically two kinds of things. First, humans. Second, everything else. It's not a plausible model of the universe. Humans obviously are always going to care about humans. Humans have some special features that nothing else has, but it does not follow that humans deserve 50% of philosophy.
Interesting. Very interesting, Graham. And with that, we come to a formal close. And I would like to thank Professor Graham Harman for giving us this opportunity. We would definitely love to host you in a physical mode in our university in future. And I ardently thank our Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, for making this occasion happen. So a bit of a formal vote of thanks to bring this event to a formal close. I would like to thank Professor Graham Harman, Professor Debnaran Bandyopadhyay, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, Dr. Shourav Dotto, our Honorable Registrar, and Professor Jayanta Kumar Saha, our Dean, Honorable Dean. We are grateful to our team members, our colleagues, our students, our research scholars, and I thank my co-compeer, Mr. Sukhendu Das, for making this event possible. We would definitely love to deliberate with you further, Professor Graham Harman, and we'll definitely keep in touch over mail and every other form of correspondence. And thank you very much. Stay safe, stay blessed, all of you. Namaskar.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.